want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. My name is Fred Litwin.
Noted author Fred Litwin. And of course, Fred is also the author of I Was a Teenage JFK Conspiracy Freak, On the Trail of Delusion, and Oliver Stone's Film Flam, The Demagogue of Dealey Plaza.
Fred Litwin is here. He's a longtime author and certainly watcher of politics.
Joining us, Fred Litwin. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to another edition of On the Trail of Delusion, the podcast where I try to separate the wheat from the chaff and try to give you something substantial on the JFK assassination as opposed to some of the nonsense you'll find on the internet and on YouTube. Well, today I've got a very, very special guest. It's Janet Banister. You might sort of remember the last name, but Janet is a choir director by day, a podcast detective by night. She is unearthing long-buried family secrets and producing some very captivating historical true crime podcasts. She is the creator of Skeletons in the Closet, Family Secrets, where she weaves deep research, layered storytelling, and a love for all things mysterious. She has a background in law, agriculture, and education, and an unshakable true crime obsession. So I want to welcome Janet Banister to On the Trail of Delusion. And by the way, Janet's great uncle was Guy Banister, who I'm sure most people realize was in the FBI, in the police in New Orleans, and a suspect in Jim Garrison's investigation. So welcome, Janet.
Thanks, Fred. I'm so happy to be here today.
Okay, so my first question is, look, how did you get interested in telling the story of your great uncle?
So Dad had told stories about him since I was a little kid. And he and Dad were fairly close, as you could have been, us being in Montana and him being in Louisiana by the end of his life there. He was a special agent in charge for the FBI here in Montana for about 10 years.
Right.
And so Dad remembers going to visit him up in Butte, and Guy used to take him through the FBI arsenal where he got to see all the Tommy guns and all the other fun stuff that they had in there. So
Right.
Dad was incredibly fond of him and looked up to him. And I remember the other side of the story is that my mother was a conspiracy theory lover. And so to married into the Banister family was like a dream, So there were chats and debates constantly about whether or not he was involved when I was a kid. And I thought it was really interesting, and I would listen in, but I couldn't shake that interest as I got older. And from now and then I would Google and see what I could find and see if I could confirm things or not confirm things. And there was just not a whole lot out there except a couple of news articles that were widely available on the internet. Of course, now newspapers.com has really opened up a lot of things in addition to all the releases being digitized.
Right.
But as I got older, I found more and more. And then finally, I was just like, we're going for it. Can't stand it. I need to know. So that's what got me started.
Okay, so what can you do? Well, tell us a bit about your great uncle. I mean, obviously he died in 1964, so I don't think it was before you were born, right? I mean, you really
Yes.
know him, so
I only have one first cousin that was old enough to have been alive when Guy was around, and she was so little, and I don't think she couldn't have remembered him even if she had met him. So, I got to know him through stories, and the release of the Oliver Stone movie in the 90s was like a bomb going off in the household, and my parents were livid at how he was portrayed, and that's what really interested me. And so I really wanted to see why there was such a big difference between how we knew him from
Right.
stories, and because Dad knew him as, pardon the term, to use the term the kids use, as like epic levels of badassery. Dad told the stories of him reaching behind him to get shouting for a clip during a shootout, and the person handing him a clip was Edgar Hoover.
Huh.
And told the stories about how he met Hoover while he was guarding the car from the Bonnie and Clyde massacre. But he apparently, Mary had always told us that he had met Hoover during while he was guarding the car. And so hearing those stories and then hearing about all the other famous people that he was connected to, and it didn't track with what I saw in the movie.
Right. Now, did you know Mary?
I did get to meet Mary. Mary, I didn't know her well, and I have since the beginning of the podcast connected with folks who knew Mary better because they were from her side of the family. Mary, by the time I met her, it was not too long before she passed away, and she was in the throes of dementia by the time I met her. And so she told my sister a lot of stories that she could recall about her and Guy when they were kids. She came up to the ranch and stayed with us out in eastern Montana. And but all I can remember her talking about was Palomino horses. She was a painter, and she was obsessed with Palomino horses. And so she would point out to the ridge outside the ranch and say, "Jan, now just imagine that, like a whole herd of Palomino horses coming over that ridge." But that's really all I recall. We have several of her paintings, and but I knew her, but not well, I guess is long.
Okay, so look, why don't you give us a short bio of Guy for our viewers?
So Guy got started in the FBI before the FBI was the FBI. He was recruited and hired before the name change. I believe the name change happened in 35, but don't quote me on that because that's coming off the top of my head, and I'm sometimes mix up dates. But he joined in, I believe it was August of 1934. When it was his official hire date. And so he got started around Indianapolis, and J. Edgar Hoover asked the agents for feedback on the FBI, and he informed Hoover that the FBI was a prostitute trying to preserve its virginity. And so as such, he was exiled to Butte, Montana, which is where they put the agents that misbehave. And he was there for quite a while. He did a lot of counterintelligence work for Hoover during World War II. And that's the least documented part of his life, and the part that I want to know the most. Guy talked to Dad about counterintelligence a great deal, but not what he did. And as you could probably imagine, there was probably a good bit of secrecy. I did uncover a story about a possible incident in which he broke into the German embassy in Mexico City, stole the documents out of the safe, and bugged the safe. And that tracks with other things that he's done, but I have no way of confirming that. I have not been able to find the source for that at all. And he was bounced around from Butte, Oklahoma City, Minneapolis. Talking to an FBI friend, he was usually exiled to the least desirable posts. Guy was an enormously effective agent. A large number of his, I went through the commendations in his file, and I was able to confirm a lot of the people that he had prosecuted actually wound up in Alcatraz. And so a lot of his folks came up on the Alcatraz rolls. So he was an effective agent, but he was a blunt instrument. He said what he said.
Yeah.
And he could not read a room to save his life. He got into a kerfluffle in Minneapolis with future Vice President Hubert Humphrey. And I still don't know the full details about that, but it sounds like he was stepping on toes. And he was then assigned to Chicago, and he was going to be moved from Chicago to Honolulu, and my cousin Mary Jane was very ill and could not get the medical care that she required in Honolulu, so he actually retired. He waited till he could retire and then retired. And he served at the time as the longest acting special agent in charge in the FBI. He made waves wherever he went, and sometimes for what I would consider good reasons, and sometimes for not. He had a temper. He was outspoken, but right before he retired, he sustained some brain damage during a surgery. When I point this out, this issue, it's often viewed by those who are more, and just to be clear, I talk to everybody. I talk to people who feel there was a lone gunman. I talk to people who feel there was a conspiracy. I talk to everybody because they all have tidbits that are useful about Guy.
Right.
And when I talk to folks who are more of a conspiracy sort of bend, it's often viewed and taken as an excuse for, or a cover, like an excuse for his behavior at best, or a cover for other things as at worst. And just to be very clear, I view this as an explanation for the behaviors you see, because the weird thing that I found, and I did not expect this, is that the way in which he was portrayed in the J. Oliver Stone movie was true to an extent. That's kind of who he was by that point that he got to New Orleans. And so you take that brain damage and then you couple that with alcoholism, and you get a very explosive ex-spy who's armed. And just imagining what my poor Aunt Mary was going through trying to get him help, because you can't disarm him. He's violent and he's got skills that the average Joe doesn't have, but he is out of control. And so he went, after his FBI career ended, he very quickly soon after went to New Orleans and was hired in an anti-corruption role. Again, the blunt instrument analogy applies, and he made a lot of waves in New Orleans. He outed 91 officers for corruption. He unfortunately was also, this is confirmed by friends, that he did threaten the bartender in the infamous incident that's always quoted, and that he did pull his gun. There was an account by a guy where he said he didn't mean to brandish his firearm. So, there's always, two sides to every story, but it's kind of hard to tell. But even his friends believe that it happened. So I do believe that it happened. However, he was held probably a little more accountable than the rest of the officers, given the levels of corruption he was seeing while he was doing his anti-corruption work. He was demoted and then refused to return to work, and was fired. During his tenure in New Orleans, he had so many threats on his life. And one, actually, somebody tried to follow through. They sent him a bomb to his office. And the bomb fell off the truck and exploded early. So thankfully no one was hurt, but it came with a letter with a threat in the name of Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen. So it gets really spicy there in New Orleans. And after he left, he, of course, started Banister and Associates. And that is the detective agency that is the source of so much speculation and so much intrigue around the time of Kennedy.
Why was he fired? Was that because of alcoholism or violence?
Well, you could say yes. You could say all of the above, but technically the firing was on the basis of the fact he refused to return to work after the demotion.
Oh, okay, right.
Paul Harvey, the columnist, characterized it as they were trying to throw him a bone and put him onto communism inquiries to try to keep him quiet. But he refused to accept that, even though his obsession with communism was quite pronounced. He refused to take the demotion, was fired.
Just as an aside, it's interesting. I've covered in my last book Richard Case Nagel, who was a big character in the conspiracy literature, and he was stationed in Korea, and he suffered a concussion in the Korean War. And the year after that, he was the sole survivor of a plane crash, and another concussion and damage to the underside of his brain. So he had organic brain damage, and that really affected him the rest of his life. And people don't want to come to grips with what that could mean, or what it means.
Well, and the tricky thing is when I'm looking at the behavior, and especially not just his behavior, the behavior of the people around him in that office, because Aaron Cohn said that every nut in New Orleans wound up in his office. And it's very true. Like, I was trying to describe it to my friend Kathy yesterday, and she said, well, what else was going on in the office? I said, well, they had this guy, David Ferry, who glued on eyebrows. Well, I'm not really sure if they were glued on or if they were like mascara, but he built submarines in his basement to send to Cuba. And she just started laughing. And it sounds too extreme to believe. But the unfortunate part of it is that I have had to help take care of family members who had similar types of issues. And his cognition, like you could have a conversation with Guy. It's not like he had dementia. It's different. Yeah. His impulse control was gone, like hair trigger temper. And do you know
what kind of surgery he was having when he had the brain damage?
I've not been able to find that at all. Dad remembers there being strokes as well. And then I also uncovered evidence that he had mini strokes. So when you're talking mini strokes, like, who knows? But it does seem to more have more impacted his decision-making skills and impulse control than it really his cognition. Like, it's not like he couldn't have a conversation. And so that kind of damage is a little bit more insidious because you can hold it together for a little while and
That
it's
was the
not
same
as
thing with Richard
apparent.
Case Nagel. He had all the jargon of a military intelligence officer. So for 20, 30 minutes, he would sound like he really knew it all. But after a
Hmm.
while, it would start to get a little, he would start to get a little unglued. But
Correct. And it's what I've really found through this process is that when there are pieces that we don't understand to a puzzle, we tend to fill them in with our life experiences.
right, yeah,
So when I see guys' behavior, I take what I have from having taken care of family with similar issues. I take banisters of similar personalities and world views, I guess you could say. And so his behavior looks entirely different to me than somebody who is coming from a conspiracist viewpoint and has only read like maybe the guy seemed a lot more suspicious in the 70s and 80s before more releases are out and we have more information. And so if you were to read just like the popular literature, he looks intensely guilty. And I see his behavior as something very, very different than they view it as. And
right.
just because of personal experience.
Sure. How about tell us a bit about his detective agency in New Orleans?
So I found an old ad and he was partnered with a gentleman named Joseph Oster.
Yeah.
And Dad was trying to remember his name. I finally did find it, so I actually, now that I think of it, I got to let Dad know I found it. But Dad had actually visited the agency in 1962,
Hmm.
and he walked in and he gave me kind of a description of what it looked like. And there were a number of secretaries. There were a decent number of detectives that were in there. It seems like there was like a core group of detectives and then people that were in and out. And he employed. Uh, he also ran the security for the Port of New Orleans. So if people wanted a job doing security for New Orleans, he was the one managing the hiring and the and all of that. He did skip tracing. He did surveillance. He did a type of surveillance where he would send detectives into companies to act as an employee to watch for people stealing from the company.
Hmm.
And there was a particular term for it that escapes me at this minute, but he also they installed bugs.
Right.
They did covert surveillance. He had 28,000 files or more on suspected or known communists throughout the entire United States, not just Louisiana. In some respects, he was operating like Louisiana's McCarthy uh, while he was there, and he testified in front of like legislative committees and whatnot for the state of Louisiana. Those files, of course, are a source of hot contention. So,
Yeah.
but yes, he did keep those files.
And so who else was in the office? I mean, there was Jack Martin and a whole variety
Hmm.
of other people. Delphine Roberts was one of the secretaries who worked there.
She was also his mistress, yes,
Right. Yes.
and he had Joseph Oster as the partner. He had Hugh Ward was in there, and of course Hugh Ward. And I this is a story I'm still trying to understand. Hugh Ward was flying a plane with Chet Morrison, um, to, and they crashed and both died. And
Right.
none of us really, and Aaron Cohen said this too, that he didn't understand why they got in that plane because Hugh Ward wasn't even a pilot. So
Hmm.
it was
Wow.
just a very odd. And the Chet Morrison is of course the guy that fired Guy, and I can't understand why he got in a plane with Guy's partner and that couldn't fly. That story has never made sense to me, but here we are. But then there's also Bill Nietzsche. Then he was another partner, another ex FBI man. He actually was at the scene when Guy died. Then you also have secretary is Mrs. Decker, whose first name escapes me, and then we have also Mary Helen Brengle,
Yeah.
and and then Aunt Mary was a part owner, and she was in and out of the office as well. And there of course the Campbell brothers were in and out, and they were also interviewed. And then another detective named Joe Newbro.
Right. Yeah.
And so those are the main folks, but there were more folks in and out, but those were the main folks, including the people you mentioned with Martin and then of course David Ferry. So
were you also, your guy produced a newsletter. Were you able to get some of the copies of his newsletter?
Dad had some of his detective books from the 1940s that had stories of things that he did in the 40s,
Right.
but I did find his columns.
I do have one newsletter he did produce,
Hmm.
which was very much about white, the racial problems.
Yes, he was a staunch pro-segregationist, which
Right.
is
Yes.
ugly but unfortunate but true. The thing that I have noticed when I'm looking at his actual writings, because very early on when I was looking at the accounts of what was going on at the detective agency, it became very apparent that there were motives behind things that were said. And so, for instance, Jack Martin, his story has a tendency to change quite a bit, and he had a terrible, terrible. He had an absolutely awful reputation around town, and then Delphine made a lot of claims about what Guy did or did wasn't into or wasn't what was important to him. And then I realized rather quickly that I didn't know exactly what was said in Guy's words. And so what I found interesting and realize that when I say this, I am not defending pro-segregation sentiments.
Of
I'm
course.
not defending racism. I am not defending how the civil rights protesters were treated because they were treated abominably. And I'm not defending anti-Semitism, but I noticed something very interesting. And I took some of your blog posts where you kind of trace like the evolution of how things kind of rolled out, and then I looked for a couple things to add to it. And then what I found was interesting is that if you look at there's a common accusation that Guy was a Nazi, and that accusation is based on the things that were found in his files. And while I can see that being kind of a natural conclusion being drawn just from it being present in the office, most people hang on to or like to propaganda or paraphernalia that they agree with, right? So what is missing in the context is that Guy was actively surveilling, had those 28,000 files where he was surveilling. He's keeping what people are publishing on all extremists, not just communists, but extremists as well.
Right. Right.
And I cannot find a trace in any. Now, you again, you can't prove a negative. I can't say it's not out there, but in everything that I have of his, there is no trace of anti-Semitism in anything he said. He's not said one word about the Jews.
Yeah.
I checked. I called a Jewish friend to double check my thinking, and because I was worried about dog whistling, where there's like a very subtle inference against Jews that's doesn't sound like it, and I still can't find any of that. But a very rabid anti-Semite in the office was Delby Roberts. You posted her 6-page testimonial to her political beliefs. Like
Yeah.
If it was in Delphine Roberts' head, it was out her mouth. We know where she stood.
Yeah.
Um,
Sure.
but a critical detail came out from the Mary Brangle interviews is that Guy and Delphine both had keys to these files. And Brangle reported that Delphine would clip things and put them in.
Right.
So we've got two context problems. One, it's the files in his office are less like this is what I'm compiling because I believe in it. It's more like your search history, like when you're looking up things on people. It's like a 1960s search history. Like this is everything that we're watching.
Yeah. For
So
sure.
that's the first context. But then the second thing is that he's not the only one placing items in there.
Mm.
And there are items being placed in there by a rabid anti-Semite. And so when I look at Guy's writing and his pro-segregation writing, is that he had the racial views you would expect a man from Louisiana born in 1901 to have. Like those are definitely present. But whenever he cites his fear about the civil rights movement, he cites communists that he's interviewed that have told him they're infiltrating the movement. Now, one of the things that I hold about extremism is that extremism has a legitimate concern wrapped up in an illegitimate solution. I believe Guy at the core had a legitimate fear that this was an incursion of like Russian or communistic intelligence agents. However, it was wrapped up in his own beliefs about race and what he believed. He believed because of what he saw there that that was what the civil rights movement was about,
Right.
rather than the civil rights movement being about maybe the civil rights movement being a genuine human rights movement that was being hijacked by a couple of infiltrators. So his, and that's what I kind of refer to when I talk about his brain damage. When all you got a hammer is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yep.
And so with the others in his office that wrote extremist ideas, it was kind of what you would more expect, like they're here to take our jobs, blah, 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 the kind of things that you always see. But with him, it was, no, I've got this guy that told me he's infiltrating this. It's like there's some basis for his fears, but then his action and his reaction, what he believed the civil rights movement to be, was contaminated. Like it was illegitimate. So
One thing that does sort of confuse me a bit is David Ferry.
yeah.
Because Guy Banister testified on behalf of David Ferry in the Eastern Airlines brouhaha, where he was trying to get his job back, and I'm sure that Guy Banister wasn't crazy about homosexuals.
Oh God, no, he's wildly homophobic.
At the same time, David Ferry was actually pro integration. He was not a segregationist. So there was certainly some differences of opinion between Ferry and Bannister, but yet they were working together on some things. Maybe they were bound together by their anti-communism.
You are extremely close to the truth. And then I also talked to a couple other folks. I talked to Rob over at Lone Gunman. He guessed, he said, I also thought it was weird, but I'm guessing that probably what the deal was is that their hatred of communism united them in some respect. So I started there, and then I finally found another source sent me a bunch of documents on David Ferry. And it turns out that Guy disliked Ferry intensely, personally, but was working with him because of what you just said. Like he felt the communist threat was so big that he had to ignore that. But the same was true for Jack Martin. He disliked Jack Martin as well. One thing, little detail that gets missed in Mary Decker's, I think her name was Mary. No, it was Mrs. Decker, but I can't recall her first name. She was a secretary there. He had been warning her to stay away from Martin long before the pistol whipping. It's hard to tell how long before, because she kind of gives just a vague statement, but she started in the office in 1961, and the pistol whipping was, of course, the day of the assassination. So this is the relationship. If you look at the relationship with these people, with Ferry, with Roberts, with Martin, Ferry, you need the context of the fact that he was hired as a defense expert. It is not, being an expert for the defense does not indicate approval. He was hired to make sure that the state, or in the case the airline, proved their case. And so if there was a functional error in how they applied their policy, Guy's job was to ensure that David's rights were respected, not that he approved of David's actions.
For sure.
And the same thing is true of Marcello. Like, it was interesting because two or three witnesses questioned his involvement with Carlos Marcello. And by the way, I'm saying Marcello instead of Marcello. The family it sounds like the family has anglicized the name, so it's Marcello. And the Marcello was, of course, mafia, and in the mafia rather. And Mary Helen Brangel, he dictated a letter for her to type up to Marcello. Or to, not to Marcel, but to Marcello's attorney. And she asked Guy why he would be involved with a mobster and with somebody who did reprehensible things. And he said, well, if the government can do it to Marcello, they can do it to us. And he felt that the case against Marcello was unjust. And so he was hired again in that defense expert capacity to defend Marcello and make sure that the government followed the law.
Right.
Joe Newbrough later related that he thought Marcello was a degenerate. And so, but he followed through because he felt that the government needed to be held to account. And Guy, in most respects, was an intense rule follower if he agreed with the rule. And he would make a good faith effort to change the rules he disagreed with. but when it involved communism, to him it was too important. It superseded everything that, you had to address that communist threat.
Okay, so tell us a bit about Jack Martin. Just who was Jack Martin, and what did he do for Guy, and then you could possibly tell us a bit about the pistol whipping incident.
Oh, okay, because I've done a lot of work on this in the last month. Okay, a red flag for me when you are looking at somebody involved in the Kennedy assassination story at all, like no matter who you're talking about, whether you're talking about and this applies especially to Garrison and Martin, but to others as well. When you see researchers ardently defend them as almost messianic figures of they told the truth when no one else would, and then you see others saying that this person's word can't be trusted. Here's the 800 ways that they violated the law or violated policy or whatever. Typically, what I find is that is a really big red flag for there being some charisma at play, so meaning that somebody who is charismatic can often persuade folks to lay aside their questions and their doubts and believe them. And so that was the first thing that was really bothering me, is because I've had a number of researchers tell me that, Jack Martin, just his story changed because he was too afraid to speak out. Okay, well, that's fine. That might be your characterization of what was going on. But I had this nagging feeling that there was some personality disorder issues at play. And now, for clarity, my other degree is in sociology, anthropology. I have a fair bit of criminology training, and especially I took several classes on criminal psych, and one that focused specifically on psychopathy. And so I was seeing some behavioral red flags. Now, I can't diagnose somebody, but I'm very familiar with the traits. And so when I see a red flag, that is where I turn up the skepticism.
Right.
If I see a red flag. All right. So I start digging, and I wanted to find out, because the infamous story about the pistol whipping is that Guy catches Martin in his files, and he is so incensed that he pistol whips him, and Martin ends the encounter with, "What are you going to do? Are you going to do me like you all did Kennedy?" And that was the infamous story that tied him to the Kennedy assassination for forever. Well, I started with your post on the initial account where Martin reported that was over a phone bill. And so I looked into that, and you had that note that you had other accounts from other people in the office that Martin had told multiple people that it was over a phone bill, and that it was likely even over a phone bill regarding his and Ferry's connection with that Catholic cult. So I start doing some more digging. It's noted in many documents that Martin was institutionalized in the 50s. But it doesn't have a diagnosis. And now, to be super clear, psychological diagnoses in the early part of the 20th century, sometimes the words are the same as words we use today, but they were used to mean different things at that time. So, like, schizophrenia was frequently diagnosed when it was something completely different. So the definitions have changed. However, the diagnosis was he was a sociopath, and with the antisocial type is what they called it. And so my best guess as to what that meant was probably what we would call today as antisocial personality disorder. My red flag is like waving wildly in the wind, because part of that traits of that diagnosis is pathological lying. And you could there's a lot of differences between types of lying, and I might be using the wrong term, but I believe it's pathological lying off the top of my head. I went through and I put documents about Jack Martin in the order that they were reported. To my best knowledge, because you actually have access to way more documents than I do because of your own research, to my best knowledge, Martin did not add the detail to the pistol whipping about shouting about Kennedy until 1977. That's my best knowledge. Now, you might know more, but I also find out that Guy is not the only person he reported to the FBI as being involved. He reported on Guy fairly shortly after the assassination, but he also reported Jimmy Hoffa. He also reported the Teamsters as large. He reported, let's see, made more claims he called the FBI in 67 and claimed to not be an admirer of Garrison, whereas like that's not how Garrison views their relationship. So there's a disconnect there. He was actually he provided a history of what he actually said during an investigation for criminal libel charges against David Lewis, and his comment about "Are you going to do me like you did Kennedy?" appears nowhere in that narrative.
Right.
And so, because this is a bit of an odd comment, but just so folks are aware, libel and slander are civil complaints in most of the United States, but at this time in Louisiana, it was a criminal charge. Guy was actually brought up himself on libel charges during his short stint as newspaper editor, and likely ended his stint at the newspaper editor. But
Right.
honestly, looking at it, I don't think he was wrong. I think he was right. But so he appeared at the FBI office and killed and accused the Teamsters of not only killing JFK but RFK. And he was as constant. I heard in a CIA document that these were called eager beavers, people who are eagerly reporting, trying to be part of something, and it tends to lack veracity. So of course, Martin himself his birth name was Edward Suggs. He had a lengthy criminal history in Texas before he moved to Louisiana. And even as a child, one of his high school teachers actually reported that his dad was in the Bonnie and Clyde gang.
Right.
That's the claim. I haven't verified that one yet, but that was the claim. But Martin had an extensive criminal history and troubled history all the way back to the point in which he was a child. And a lot of these are red flags for things that would still fit the modern day diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. So with that at play, nothing by Martin can be trusted. My hot take on Martin is that his story about Guy and the pistol whipping, why it changed is he was covering his own actions, whether it was his own plot to kill Kennedy or his own malfeasance in some other respect. Is if the attention is on Guy, the dead guy, they're not looking at him. But there's also an attention-seeking portion in my mind. This is my opinion. People can disagree, but the way in which he evolved his story with Garrison, there was an attention-seeking part of it too. There's kind of a power play where they get a little thrill in that they've deceived and they're getting away with it. And so I strongly suspect that's what was going on with Martin. Now, does that mean Guy was innocent? Absolutely not. The guy looked suspicious because Guy was planning things. Guy was acting outside of the law. So sometimes somebody looks suspicious because they are being suspicious, but not for the thing you think they're doing.
That's really true. And I've always said, a good example of that is that, when I was a teenager, my mother said, "Are you smoking?" I said, "Well, I'm not." She said, "Well, I'm going to go check your room when you're in school to see if you're smoking." And I got very nervous because I wasn't smoking, but maybe she'll find the gay pornography under my bed. I do agree with you on Martin that he's a massive attention seeker. Oh my God. I mean that.
Yeah.
I mean, that man would do anything to get some attention from anybody.
Right. And there was another, and I was starting to really get concerned about Martin. What was he hiding to make that extraordinary of claims? What was he hiding? And another investigator noticed that, if you're looking at somebody involved in this New Orleans office, you really should be looking at Martin. And so in my mind, when it comes to the pistol whipping, knowing how Banisters operate, like the family culture, Guy's personality, plus the damage, my strong suspicion is that what likely happened during that pistol whipping, because now, to be clear, I don't have an account from Guy as to what happened. We have Roberts and her account shifted. Martin's accounts shifted significantly. And to the point where Roberts and Martin don't agree at all as to even how it happened. Roberts said that Guy caught Martin behind the rail looking through the files, and she characterized that as a sign that maybe he was grabbing the file on Oswald. And so she didn't even meant I think Martin's herself, or not Martin, sorry, I think Roberts herself might be doing a bit of gaslighting there, just based on some things she said to Mary Brangle.
Yeah.
Oswald's name was not even brought up, but the day after the assassination, Roberts is looking at Brangle like, well, he was in this office all the time. And Brangle's kind of like, I'm pretty sure he wasn't. And so I think Roberts' claims have an entirely different driver. I think hers was heavily attention seeking. But from Guy's perspective, my best guess, and then this is an opinion, this is an inference, this is me. Like most people, when they make inferences about what they don't understand, they portray it as the truth. I'm telling you that I'm telling you the pieces that I've used to construct this. My best guess is that Guy lost his temper because Martin had been a pain in the ass for so long that when he finally got the phone bill and saw the charges, it was just, he'd had it. And I agree that I think it really was over the phone bill, but I think it's not just the phone bill. It was the straw that broke the camel's back over everything else he was doing, because you could see that he was warning people in the office to stay away from Martin before this broke out.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right. By the way, I have a tape that I'm going to be publishing soon with Jack Martin, where he, if you remember, there was the NBC documentary about Jim Garrison.
Yes, I've been catching up on your YouTube. Yeah.
And so Martin calls, Martin was taping his own phone calls. And so he telephones Aaron Cohn, and he says, the NBC people, they want to talk to me. And, I know a lot about Garrison. I could sink this guy in a minute. I mean, I could really sink him. But you know what? What's in it for me? Garrison will go after me, and I need some money. And what should I do? And Aaron Cohn says, you know what? Just tell the truth. And then Jack Martin calls Plotkin, his lawyer, and says the same thing. What should I do? I need money. And Plotkin says, well, just do the right thing. Just tell the truth. And then he calls the reporter at Rick Townley at WDSU, and goes into, I really want to talk to you, and I have so much to say about Garrison, but he's going to come after me, and I don't have any money. And Townley says, well, guess what? We don't pay people. That's not what we do. But I'd love to talk to you. And at the end of the conversation, Barton hangs up the phone and says into the microphone, this is Jack Martin. I've been taping phone calls today, and I've been trying to, at behest of Garrison, I've been trying to get people to admit that, they're paying people. I mean, it's just quite an admission right there on tape.
Oh, absolutely. And so with folks, if he truly was had antisocial personality disorder, there is no loyalty to anyone with that diagnosis. If you are thrown under the bus, any relationship, your best friend of 30 years would be thrown under the bus in an instant if there was something to gain.
So let me ask you, have you, Jack Martin had a son. Have you been able to find his son?
No, I have intentionally not sought him out, or any relatives of the folks that I feel. It was hard enough looking at the hard things in my own family. I did not feel good about, I wanted to be able to tell the truth, and I did not want to put them in a bad spot because of everything I saw with Martin. Now you clearly know more than me about Martin's son, and that's okay. But I
don't know that much. I just know that he had in 1967, and he had like a 6-year-old son. 6 or 7 years old.
Yes, it was mentioned in the documents.
And that's all I know. I haven't actually even found his obituary. I mean, I don't know if you've seen Martin's obituary or not. I can't find it. So I don't know when he died. But anyways, I would love to find his son just to see what he remembers, or whether he has any documents, or, I'd just love to know. But because he did have a son. I thought it was amazing that Jack Martin told the HSCA that John Dean of Watergate fame was involved.
He made that claim, yeah, and he also made claims that on, I actually have the link right here. Let me look and see what he actually tried to say here. He was reporting to the, he was also reporting to the FBI. I'll send you this link too. He was reporting to the FBI on, well, you should pay as much attention to this as you do to the Watergate scandal.
Right, right.
Yeah, I think it's again more attention seeking and dominance kind of.
So look, I want to go back up a bit and just I want to,
Mhm.
if you could tell us a bit about your journey here, of who you've been talking to, where you're
Mhm.
going, your podcast, what's coming up in the future, etc. So just tell us about your journey here and how it's going and who you've been talking to.
So, when I first got started, I was so overwhelmed by the volume of literature
Yeah,
that I did not even know where to start. So I asked on the JFK sub on Reddit, like, where do I get started? And I got some really good advice in there the first day that really pissed me off because I tried to work around it and then I just realized I couldn't. And I really wanted to know because I immediately perceived that there was old literature that likely was going to have not stood up well to the test of time due to the early authors. They, while I disagree with a lot of folks that wrote things on Guy early on, I understand that in a lot of respects they were shooting in the dark. I do understand that there was a lot less available at the time. The I wanted to know who did, like, give me a list. Who should I read? Who should I not? And a commenter got on there and said, you really need to talk to everybody. And I'm like, son of a gun. Okay, fine. So I started with Jefferson Morley over at JFK Facts. He gave me a lot of lovely pointers, and then I've interviewed rapidly. I discovered that I needed to talk to everybody on every side of the debate because everyone had good information on Guy. I started comparing the way Guy was portrayed in conspiracy leaning literature, and I compared it to how Guy was portrayed in lone gunman leaning literature. And I did find that, like, he looked like two different people
right.
overall. But then I also found that there were tidbits of really important information in all of the above. And that what would happen if I took all those tidbits and built a new mosaic of who he was.
Yeah,
And so they all captured a side of the coin, but not both sides of the coin. And so that's where I started really talking to. I got involved with you and Gus Russo. I've talked with Lone Gunman, Triple B and Joe B over at Lone Gunman. So I've got a pretty heavy dosing on both sides of the debate, whichever way you lean.
right.
I then The first season was not, I won't say easy to put out, but it was all about everything that happened up until he was fired from the NOPD. That was significantly easier to approach than the JFK years because of the early years was what Dad remembered the most. So I had a lot more to go off of. And I didn't feel like I was shooting quite so much in the dark. When I got to the JFK years, I realized rapidly I was shooting in the dark. And in that, around the time I released the episode 9 of the first season, I got very, very, very sick. And it turned out to be the onset of autoimmune disease on top of some other things. I had a mass in my neck, and I had autoimmune disease, and I had like a gallbladder issue. So I got really, really ill, and I had to put it down for a while just to focus on just surviving. I had to make sure I could still teach at my day job. I missed a lot of school because of how sick I was. I couldn't get up the steps after a while. And so once that had been addressed, then I picked it back up and I started working again. And I met along the way Professor Robert Vitt, who teaches a class on the assassination in Long Beach. He has been an invaluable source because he, like me, wants to build a mosaic from all sources.
Right.
So he is incredibly well researched and well read. So he's able to argue several different viewpoints, and which is really helpful for me. And so what I've been doing is I've been inserting my research on Guy into his information on the assassination as a whole, and that's what season 2 has been about. We call it a wilderness of errors, and of course the play off the wilderness of mirrors that's often used. And the results of this is that I quickly, much like the rest of my life, I don't fit into groups very easily, and I always feel like the square peg in the round hole. But what I've really rapidly realized is that my view of the assassination with the research that I have, I'm not nearly as realizing that the caveat here is that I'm a newcomer. I didn't choose the JFK life. The JFK life chose me. So I just, realizing that I come to this party late, my view of what I think happened is not represented by either side. And so I've been trying to find a way to communicate what I really think is going on and a better way to view everything. And at first I chose puzzle pieces, and then I realized that a good friend and mentor, Jeff Meek, he uses the puzzle piece analogy. So I didn't want to like tromp on his toes. So I've been working on it. So I built my view of what I think went down with the assassination and with Guy off of what's called the Swiss cheese model of accidents. I have long been obsessed with how airplane disasters unfold, because quite often you have a very intensely awful disaster that unfolds from a string of small errors. Like, for instance, there was a plane that broke apart midair because of just the handle on the hatch. It appeared to be closed. The gentleman that closed it had every reason to believe it was closed, but it was not in fact closed. It popped open. And so then what contributed to that was the fact is that there were no vents in the floor, so there was no way to equalize the pressure. So the plane broke apart. And then you find out there's this string of policy errors in which that known issue was not addressed. So it's like this large string of holes. So what the Swiss cheese analogy refers to is, so like if you throw a bunch of slices of Swiss cheese in a pile and you hold it up, the hole that you can see through where the holes line up, that's how these accidents happens. Each layer of cheese is a layer of protection against an accident. And when sometimes, though, tragically, these holes all line up and something gets through, because it's impossible to make a bulletproof layer of protection, because people are people, and things break down. So now I want to take the analogy a little further. So imagine like each piece of Swiss cheese is a layer of protection around the president. So maybe one for the FBI, one for the CIA, one for the Secret Service. Not only do you have natural holes that are showing there, you might be able to hold it up to the light and see the thin spots. And where a conspiracy creeps in and enters the chat is where the thin spots are where you can poke holes. The problem I'm trying to solve for is assumptions. And the thing that I have noticed, I've been watching very closely not only how people talk to me, but also how they talk to each other. And I have noticed that when researchers disagree, there's often an assumption in place that creates what we call the double empathy problem, where negative assumptions are made by both based on what's said. And I see the common assumption on the conspiracist side is that folks on the lone gunman side are ignoring evidence. The common assumption I see on the lone gunman side of the folks of the conspiracy side is that they're overinflating and the term I would use would be hypermentalization, where you see patterns that appear to be related but really in actuality aren't. And when folks on both sides are using language to describe their thoughts, they're quite often using the same words, but actually in reality meaning different concepts. And so it creates not only that empathy problem, but also a communication problem. And so the framework that I'm using is that I'm including slices of cheese and finding the holes from everybody. And when all of those factors interplay, that you find really interesting things that we haven't seen before. And I don't feel like JFK research, there are bad actors. There are people who are, picking up on the story and for their own purposes. But that's relatively rare. Mostly it's misunderstanding and assumption at play. I think what's really holding us back from finding and making new discoveries is not the fact that we need more documents released, which more documents are always helpful because it gives context. But I really feel that we are not going to start making new discoveries in JFK research until we solve that communication issue. Because there is a heavy, and this is more true with people in like chat groups. Like I see this on Reddit, I see this online, I see this in the comments on videos, that they don't see that their evidence and what they've pieced together is heavily cherry-picked. I see that less with serious researchers because they've looked through the documents and understand context a little better. But I actually had a guy on Reddit tell me that if you think Guy Banister would not be like involved, like you don't effing know Guy Banister. And I'm like, I'm literally his niece, but okay, you go, Skippy. But I really feel that to move forward, we got to solve the communication problem. So my framework, and I'm calling it multiple overlapping conspiracy, and it's based on the Swiss cheese model.
Okay. Well, I think actually what's going to really help in the future is going to be the digitization of all
Yes, I agree with
records
that
in
as
the
well.
National Archives, because you've got 5 million pages in the archives. Maybe a million are digitized on the Mary Farrell site. It's like 4 million pages that are not digitized. And once they're digitized and OCR'd, so you can actually search through the text, we'll find, I mean, from my perspective, I think we'll find lots of debunking stuff, but we'll find stuff. And a good example of that is when I found when Google started digitizing a lot of court records, and I actually found the solution to the Bolton Ford problem
Yeah.
by just a Google search, where because they had digitized a number of things. So I'm hoping that, and also I should say other databases. In other words, if we're talking, let's say, about the Clinton sighting of Clay Shaw, perhaps there's somebody's papers at the University of Shreveport in Louisiana. When they're digitized, maybe we'll find more about John Manchester or something, and so over time, as more stuff gets digitized and we can do more searches, there'll be all sorts of interesting little things that'll come up. You might find a lot more
Yeah.
about Guy Bannister in some, who knows, somebody's papers in some university down south that you would never think of looking into until, maybe they're digitized.
Well, and absolutely. And that's been one of the aspects of the podcast too. Like just before you got on, I got an email from somebody introducing me to a friend of Guy and Mary's that I didn't know.
Right.
So that was still alive. So like there, yeah, things will keep coming and creeping through the woodwork. You're absolutely right. And I do believe that a good amount of what has been proposed as highly suspicious, not just with Guy, but in the assassination as a whole, we'll find as you get things that are digitized, we'll find more context to and find that, well, it was suspicious for a different reason. And
Right. Yeah, for
so
sure. Yes.
yeah, and so it's I don't want to minimize the second that I minimize suspicion, that's when I people stop listening. I'm trying to avoid the knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah.
And that's just the educator, the way that I was just taught to be an educator. And I did not determine when I was evaluating who was I going to use for my sources and for my podcast. I wasn't evaluating who I was going to use based on viewpoint. I was evaluating who I was going to use by who I felt safe working with. And I felt safe working with everybody on every side, like most people on every side, with two notable exceptions where there was some really ugly incidents. Thankfully, there was a witness to one, and that made me feel a little better that it wasn't just me. But so I worked with who I felt safe working with,
Right.
and because I can listen and I can see what their reasoning behind what they believed, and then I can take that and pick apart and see, well, I don't think you were spot on with this, but you had something else here, and then this is important. So I'm hoping that rather than turning people off and rather than being dismissed, because I'm not following the typical conspiracy bent on Guy, I'm hoping rather than turning people off and making them stop listening, that they stop to think about, well, what assumptions have I made and what have I missed?
Right.
Is what I'm hoping will happen.
So tell us where we can find your podcast and what's coming up on your podcast in the future.
Well, a lot of our discussions about Martin and Ferry are coming up, and right now I released this week. Well, first off, you can find me at dapperjackalopemedia.com, and I put buttons on there for you to click and follow on whatever platform you listen.
Right.
I tried to move to YouTube, but my current podcast platform has blocked the ability to post my RSS feed to YouTube.
Right.
So
Oh, well.
I'm working on the YouTube issue. It might be a while before it gets solved. I might actually have to leave my platform right to be able to solve that, and I don't want to do that in the middle of what's coming up. So the first 4 episodes we lay out the Robert Vitt and I lay out the usual suspects, the geopolitical landscape that was leading up to the assassination, and why the times were so contentious. And then episode 5 is out, and that is part 1 of the Banister and Associates. And so I'm working on episode 6 right now. That comes out on Tuesday. Episode 6 is about evaluating evidence, and which is critical when you're looking at these very contradictory and changing stories about what happened with Guy. That's critical. You know how to evaluate the evidence. And then from there, we're moving. I'm finishing up Guy and his connections. And then we're moving back to a chronological order of what happened starting on Thursday night in Dallas. And Robert has reconstructed from multiple viewpoints as to the movements of Oswald and the movements of Kennedy himself. And he's got this story all pieced together. And then when we get to the day of the assassination, I have also reconstructed what likely Guy's day was there, because there's an accusation that he was on the grassy knoll. And so I had you and I had several conversations while I was looking into that, because I was having trouble.
Who wasn't on the grassy knoll?
Right. It would be
crowded place.
Yeah, it would be like up in Alaska, they call it combat fishing when everybody's on the river at the same time. It would have looked like a river in Alaska during salmon season. But you're in the vein of what you just said. A lot of this season will be debunking.
Right.
There's a lot of things, like a really good example. Mary Helen Brangle found it incredibly suspicious that Guy had weapons in his office, and that he showed them off in hushed tones to visitors who came. So to her, what that meant, I think Mary Helen Brangle is an honest person. And I believe, just based on some just some context clues, that I do believe she was mistaken about what everything meant, but I think she was an honest person.
Yeah.
And so like right before I read that account, or right after rather, I had gone out to the ranch, and Dad had just acquired some new pistols, and he just said, "Jan, you gotta see what I have in the office." And so he took me in there, and of course, what Banisters do, it's you could call it a ritual, is that when you get a new weapon, we're all gun nuts, and when you get a new weapon, you gotta handle it, you gotta check the chamber, you've got to you gotta ooh and on, like, oh, it's beautiful, and so my sons are in on that as well. My son was pretty excited when he saw what Dad had got. And so if you know that's normal for Banisters, what Mary Helen Brangle saw in the office was not weird. This is not out of the ordinary.
That's right.
And then you also have another context clue, that he was in the middle of moving out of the marital home. He was leaving Mary, and so he was storing his guns at the office because he had nowhere safe for them to go while he was moving. So what do you do? What does Banister do when his gun collection's right there and there's dudes coming in? You show them off.
Yeah.
But
so tell me, are you planning to write a book?
You're about the 5th person to ask. And I have, okay, so here's my feelings on the book. I think I should. Having had a conversation with, because I emailed you some questions, I talked with, and what's funny is I've gotten that question from everybody on every side. Are you going to write a book? From the conspiracy side, from the lone gunman side. I want to. I think it would be a good idea, because as I look at the podcast, looking back, of course, you always see things you could have done better. I think it would be a good idea to organize the information in a different manner that would be maybe a little bit more clear about Guy's story specifically. At the same time, I still stand on my work in the podcast. I'm doing the best I can as a choir teacher, and this is like what I can do in my spare time. I would like to. I'll keep in touch with you folks that have written books, so I can make some decisions so that I don't get quite so overwhelmed with trying to figure out where to start. But I have written some terrible novels before that will never ever see the light of day. So, but I think I would like to. And I'm also working on my next podcast too, which is way more in my wheelhouse, which is how to not start a cult. Probably, which is we talk a lot about cults, and I've had a hyperfixation on cults for years, but all of my training in sociology was done through the lens of a cult, because people could see social rules better in things that were not like in social situations that were not like what they were used to.
Right.
So all of my training was through cults, and Montana has a bit of a cult problem. And because of our isolation and our culture in which we, mind your own business, there's a lot of cults up here. One of my students in my sociology class back up in the western side of the state actually lived next door to an acting cult where actors were brought up and promised lessons but were forced into labor to build the camp. So it was insane.
I'll tell
But
you a story about, one of my artists on Northern Blues. I
yes, yes.
I don't want
Hmm.
to say his name, but he was playing. If you tour, you're touring blues clubs around the United States. He was doing a tour in the United States, and he was in a place in Montana, and you have to play 2 or 3 sets, and it's all in
Hmm.
a contract. And he finished his first set. He sat down for a break, and after a few minutes, the bar owner said, "You better go back up there." He said, "Well, I'm just not, I'm only supposed to play 2 sets or whatever." And he pulled out his gun, and you better get up there. And he was forced to play like 7 or 8 sets that night. He was scared out of his mind, and he said, "I'm never going to go back there." But it's a story he tells. It's about Montana, and my sister lives in Boston,
Hmm.
and we were there last Passover, and one of they attend all these courses at Brandeis, and there's a music instructor at Brandeis who has his own little bluegrass band, and he gives a course on the history of country music and bluegrass. But he lived in Montana for many years, which he
Oh, do you know where?
loves. Um, I can't remember where off the top of my head. I have to go search for it. But he gave the last lecture was all about cults starting in Montana. The whole thing
Hmm.
was about, oh my God, this place I love. I love this place, but there's a lot of strange things happening here.
Yeah, it's a peculiar blend of libertarianism and isolation.
Yeah.
And like my dad's best friend, he was legendary. He was legendary. I told a story about him on episode 3 or 4, a situation where some kids had some young men had driven through his fence to go fishing down at the creek. And when they came back up, he waited for them, and he informed them they were going to be fixing that fence. And they pulled a 22 pistol out on him and said, "Make us, old man." And he said, he pulled out a 45 and said, "Pull the trigger or fix the fence." And they found that in fact they could fix that fence, and they did so. And so, but it's a different vibe, and it's different than even 20 or 30 years ago. Up here, I love my home state, but uh, we have back in the 90s. Actually, I just had this made. I don't know if you can see it, but back in the
Yeah.
90s, my mom had a hardware store, and we had a t-shirt that said "Montana, land of the big sky and the FBI," because that was just right when they caught the Unabomber, and when
Uh,
we caught, and then when the Freeman standoff, which they thought was going to be another Waco, it was right after Waco. We attract folks who have nowhere else to go, and that creates an interesting vibe. But um, the long story short with my second podcast is that a lot of people who talk about cults are there. They show up they want to know the ghoulish details and why people followed them, and why would you ever believe that, blah blah blah. I think we're missing the big take is like, how do we not do that? Like, there are so many social situations where we say, well, this is feeling kind of culty. Well, the reason it feels kind of culty is that the same mechanism that creates toxic environments in like workplaces and families are the same mechanisms that are used to create a cult. It's
mm,
just more extreme.
right.
And so my preposition is that we diffuse those situations by not allowing the tools of abuse to be effective. So, but anyway, the this lovely Tumblr is available on my website,
Okay.
and that the way that folks can support my pod is I am intentionally not put any of the information behind a paywall,
That's nice.
because I that's how important it is that we have this discussion. It's important to me. It's important to Robert. If you want to support us, how you can do that is by going to my website and using our shop. Your books are in my bookshop, and as well as the other authors that I've used. And the my merch shop is done. My merch shop is up and going. I might have to make some changes to it coming very soon, but the designs will stay the same even if I have to change my platform for my merch shop. And so how you can help us is just by shopping there.
Okay, that's great. Look, I strongly hope you do a book. I mean, it's not just Guy Bannister. It's the whole story the book could be In Search of Guy Bannister.
Mhm.
Your whole story of how you're doing your research and where you're going. It's very, very interesting. So what I'd like to do is
Yeah.
have you back on after the
Mhm.
next several episodes. Have you back on to discuss Guy further.
Sure, I would love to, Fred, and I really appreciate all the help and support you've given along the way. You and Gus and Jeff Meek and Professor Vitt and the folks that have kind of held my hand along the way and kind of said, kind of pointed me in the right direction have been invaluable, and I want to make sure that they know that they are appreciated.
Well,
So.
thank you. Thank you for being a guest of On the Trail of Delusion.